hear all of that. But God has given him a tremendous ability to think on his feet, to study, to be a scholar. And thirdly, today, as I introduce him to you tonight, he's become a very influential legislator in our state. And he's very knowledgeable. God has used him, given him a great ability to mingle and to take a conservative position. It's my privilege tonight to introduce Nathan Winters.
Well, thank you very much. It is a privilege to be here tonight. And I thank you for the opportunity to speak as well. This has been a tremendous day. I know that we live in an age in which people are frustrated, if you will, with the press. And sometimes we know that we live in a day of hot air. And news today seems to be designed less to inform and more to enrage. And as a result, many people are fed up with the process. It reminds me of the story of a young man that had been in a ministry for just a few weeks. He was following hard on the heels of a man that had been there for over 20 years. And so he was going around updating things around the building, and everybody liked the way the new building looked. But his style was different than the old pastor. And so he thought everything was going fine, until one day he went into the men's restroom, and after he washed his hands, he turned around and he went over to the new hand dryers that he had just installed. And someone had installed a sign on the front of that said, "For a sample of this week's sermon, please push the button." I think we are watching today as the American people are pushing the button in many ways on the American media. And today we've heard a tremendous counter-argument to a lot of the hot air that we hear. And it isn't every day that you have the privilege of listening to a person from the Heritage Foundation. The Heritage Foundation was a hero to one of my heroes, Ronald Reagan. When I was a kid, my parents made the decision not to allow us to grow up with a TV that had channels. Dad went out and he bought one of those little box sets that had a VHS player in there, and he bought every Roy Rogers he could get. That's what he grew up on. And Gene Autry, and we got a little Bonanza, but not much. But when I was a kid, my little brother and I, when we went out to play, we would fight over who got to be Ronald Reagan beating the communists. What's really wonderful is today we've had the privilege of listening to the Heritage Foundation, who was a tremendous sidekick to one of my heroes, Ronald Reagan. And Ryan has been wonderful. He's proven the value of the Heritage Foundation. In an article that he wrote a couple months ago, and he alluded to it today, he mentioned that heterosexuals are the ones responsible for the breakdown in marriage. I believe he's right. When you consider that the Ashley Madison website had over 33 million people demonstrating a lack of fidelity in their marital relationships, you can see that he's right. Heterosexuals are responsible for the breakdown in marriage. I'm honored to be with you this evening, and I've had the privilege of getting to know many of you over these last few years, and we have had the privilege of standing shoulder to shoulder in some of the battles to uphold the truths that undergird our society. As communicators, and I'm well aware of the audience I'm speaking to tonight, as communicators, you know exactly what I'm thinking. I have so much to say, and the last thing I want to happen is for you to leave unchanged. I learned in seminary that the mind can only receive what the backside can endure, so I'm going to be short-winded tonight, but I want to speak directly to the challenges that we face and the necessity that we, of all people, stand. And I want to start by explaining why we are here. We've gathered here because we love our country, and we recognize a tremendous sense of unrest. That is exactly what happens when the freedoms that we hold so dear are infringed. You and I, as men and women of faith, recognize, as our founders did, that there is something bigger, a kingdom higher. a cause greater than any one life. You and I come from a wide variety of religious backgrounds, and I'm sure we could have some incredible debate, even within this room, but this isn't the venue for that. We are here because we obviously share a common belief that there is a truth higher than man's opinion. We recognize the words of the psalmist who wrote this over 3,000 years ago. Forever, O Lord, your word is settled in heaven. So I'm going to follow a format that I have followed for many years for speeches both political and in the pulpit. I want to give you the situation, the complication, the resolution, and the celebration. Let's start with the situation. We in America are the inheritors of a great dream, a vision where men lived according to the dictates of their consciences within the confines of very specific and limited laws. These revolutionary dreamers designed a government that fulfilled the hopes of the billions that suffered in bondage since man fell back in the garden. Many times we fail to realize how rare freedom is. Historians Ted and Chris Stewart said this several years back in an interview. They said, I believe it's in human nature to look around at the world today and the world that our parents lived in yesterday and the world we assume our children will live in tomorrow and say this is the normal state of the world, that things don't change. But they said self-governance is extraordinarily unique. You can talk to historians who specialize in this area, and they believe that maybe 4 to 4.5% of all humanity have actually been able to control their own destinies and lives. And what we failed to recognize today is that freedom is a rare gift to be cherished, a gift to be defended at all cost. Our founders knew this fact. In the U.S. Capitol building, there is a sign that reads, without freedom of thought, there can be no such thing as wisdom, and no such thing as public liberty without freedom of speech. Let me repeat it. Without freedom of thought, there can be no such thing as wisdom, and no such thing as public liberty without freedom of speech. Now that statement was made by a young Benjamin Franklin in the year 1722, 67 years before his work at the Constitutional Convention. Fresh on his mind and the minds of many people in his day were stories like that of John Bunyan, who just 60 years before had been arrested outside of the village of Bedford in England. And the charge was that he didn't have a license to preach, and that according to the Conventional Act, no man had the right to speak of his belief without a license from the state. Now, Mr. Bunyan, a tinker by trade with very little formal education, refused a license and explained why with a very simple eloquence. He made this statement, and I would challenge you to look this up, type in the Breedlove Papers, and you'll find the actual transcript of the trial. It's good enough, if I read it right here, that you could enjoy it more than what I'm giving you right now. But I'm just going to give you an excerpt. He said this, "No man or company of men may grant or deny me leave to preach. These licenses of which you speak, my Lord, are symbols not of a right, but of a privilege. Implied therein is the principle that a mere man can extend or withhold them according to his whims. I speak not of privileges, but of rights. Privileges granted by men may be denied by men. Rights, though, are granted by God, and can be legitimately denied by no man. I must therefore refuse to comply." All for some bunions. Bunyan spent the next 12 years imprisoned in the Bedford County Jail. While in prison, John Bunyan produced one of the most marvelous works of English literature. A work that within the last few years was ranked in one national British poll as the most important work of English fiction of all time. That's a high standard. It was entitled Pilgrim's Progress. Friends, that isn't that long ago. Not really. Our founders were nearer it than we. And while freedom of the mind is the most basic right of a free society, throughout history, it hasn't always been recognized. But our fathers knew it, and they built the country upon this bedrock principle. They deemed its cause higher than any other cause. Is dream their highest ambition? They placed foremost amongst the Bill of Rights, Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion, nor prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And because of their wisdom, we have been privileged to live in a brief space in time where we are able to speak our minds freely because they fought for the right to do so. But that brings me to my complication. Today, our society has spurned the truth and adopted the new doctrine of cultural relativism. What poison we play with. Today, we come to a generation who hold these hard-won rights lightly. They've come to believe that even these sacred rights must be offered before the idol of political correctness, as if personal anarchy defines a free society. This belief is no longer confined to the coastal regions, California and New York. We find it in the small towns of Kentucky and Idaho, and in the ordinances passed in villages in Wyoming and New Mexico. Wyoming Catholic College publishes a pamphlet called Integritas. I can't recommend this more highly. One edition, and I would ask that you try to get this for yourself. One edition from earlier this year entitled Moral Law and Evangelization by Dr. Arthur M. Hipler, which is a condensation of a program that he presented in the fall of last year. It is absolutely powerful. He references in this pamphlet right here, and I could read it to you, but I won't. I would ask that you go look it up for yourself. He references the work of several research psychologists who've come up with a technical term for our culture. They claim, now get this, and you might want to write it down, it's a technical term. They claim that we are a weird culture. Kid you not, it's wonderful. Now, it's an acrostic. Let me explain it. We are a Western, educated, industrialized, rich democracy. Weird. Western, educated, industrialized, rich democracy. And in this article, he powerfully proves that our philosophy today has educated us into philosophical and moral confusion. I believe he's right. Because we can see it around us today. We heard it this morning. We, the inheritors of a sense of freedom, based upon self-evident truths, are told that there is no such thing today. And any society that would hold that belief is bound for decay and destruction, because there's no longer any foundation to hold up the edifice of that culture. In 1838, a 28-year-old young man gave a speech entitled The Perpetuations of Our Political Institutions, and I believe that the 1838 speech is excellent for us today, because in that speech he powerfully reasoned that his generation, who had learned firsthand from the founding generation, found themselves the legal inheritors of certain fundamental blessings received from a once hardy, brave, and patriotic, but now departed race of ancestors. He said they were a fortress of strength, but what invading foemen could not do, the silent artillery of time had already done. They were gone. And what they left to the generation to follow was a powerful country. He said it this way. He said, all the armies of Europe, Asia, and Africa combined, with all the treasures of the earth in their military chest, with a Bonaparte to lead them, could not by force take one drink from the Ohio River or lay one track upon the Blue Ridge Mountains. Then the young Mr. Lincoln asked this question. At what point, then, is the approach of danger to be expected? He said, I answer it this way. If it ever reaches, it must spring up from among us. It cannot come from abroad. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. As a nation of free men, we must live through all time or die by suicide. I contend, brothers and sisters, that these words, terrible though they may be, are coming true. Today there is a tyranny of ideas that are antithetical to the views of our forefathers. Today it seems that freedom has been redefined as an absence of moral law. Today people have been taught to expect more from government than from the very freedom to pursue happiness. Today, freedom has grown so large, it is viewed as a master rather than a servant to the people. Today, our society cheers as bakers and photographers are forced to bow or go out of business if they declare their conscience is free. Today, politicians are declared obtuse or intolerant if they declare that certain anti-discrimination laws are actually highly discriminatory against people of faith. Today, some would even demand that faith leaders should turn in their sermons and homilies for scrutiny by the government. That's why we meet. Today, we are in a struggle for the very soul of America. As Mr. Barton explained carefully, this is the reason why our fathers spoke so hard from the pulpit to make sure that our freedoms are upheld. And I believe that we are in this struggle because faith leaders have stepped into the shadows. I'm only an amateur in history, but I pitched this idea to Mr. Barton, and he's a professional in the fields, and he actually added to the idea. I believe that Christians began to falter in the public arena in the 1920s and 30s. 3 events happened in near succession that caused faith leaders to step away. Number 1, the 1925 Scopes monkey trial caused some to question the foundational document of our faith. And then secondly, the Great Depression, which started in October of 1929, was blamed on Herbert Hoover. By the way, anyone who had been in that situation would have faced the same consequence. But Herbert Hoover had been heavily supported by Christians. And then thirdly, Prohibition, which had been heavily pushed by Billy Sunday and the Women's Christian Temperance Union, was repealed in 1933. And I believe that Christians began to sense opposition in a country that they had designed. And we lost our confidence. We stepped away from the public square. And let me just say this tonight. History has proven that our country is not better for our absence.
That's right.
That brings me to the resolution. We must resolve tonight to be involved again. If there is to be any hope, it must surely rest with those who recognize an ultimate truth that has come down to us through the ages that is worthy and reliable. And though our culture may spurn it and appeal to the lie of cultural relativism, though we know that the truths for which we stand are self-evident and have always been, you and I as clergy have dedicated our lives to the research of truth and then to the task of speaking these truths into the world around us. We should take this up and carry it to our state. You see, truth is immortal. You can deny its existence, ridicule its followers, persecute its practice, or try to marginalize its teaching, but truth will do as it has always done. Truth will always march forward. Cultures come and go. Political seasons change, but truth will abide forever. So let us first identify with the belief our founders had that there is foundational truth, that it truly exists, and then let us be on the right side of truth. Edmund Burke taught us long ago that there's a contract between the generations. That as each generation lives, they have the duty to uphold the contract for the next. Let me just say this. It is not our birthright, it is not our place to give away something that another fought and died for. It is not our right to sacrifice freedom upon the altar of conformity. We must preserve for our children the inheritance we received from our fathers. There's a biblical story that illustrates this very well. I spoke on it recently. I'll remind you in this story of Naboth and his vineyard. It's found in the book of 1 Kings. Naboth rightly believed that his inheritance was worth preserving for his children. One day, King Ahab came walking out of his palace, and he walked down through the vineyards, and he came up to Naboth, and he said, Naboth, I want your vineyard. And he began to demand it of Naboth, and Naboth said no. Ahab began to threaten just a little bit, and eventually Naboth came to this. It's found in 1 Kings chapter 21. The Lord forbid that I should give the inheritance of my fathers to you. We may feel fatigued at times. We can grow fatalistic. It seems sometimes as though the entirety of my message seems to be to keep others from surrendering to fatalism. We must never surrender to fatalism. If it be our lot to watch freedom fail in our day, I believe that we ought to hold on to it and dig our heels in so that as it tips over the edge, at least our children will be able to follow the furrows back out of the problem that we've allowed to happen. We must never surrender, though. I don't believe that we will fail if we stand for truth in our time. If we hold these truths, our children will know the freedoms of our fathers. And that brings me to my final point tonight, the celebration. Our children can know freedom. The same freedoms we inherited from our fathers, if we will but stand for it. In the last 2 years, God has seen fit to give my wife and I 3 children. They are 4, 6, and 9. One of them we adopted 2 years ago, and 2 look like it's going to happen pretty soon. And many of you know what I've been experiencing as a dad. It's a thrill, it's a little terrifying, and it's definitely tiring. But it's wonderful in a way that you can't experience otherwise. More and more I'm out late at night in some part of my legislative district, or I'm out at the church late, and I get home and they're all asleep, and I'll go in to check on them. My littlest one, he has blonde hair, and at night it seems to stick out like the Statue of Liberty's crown. And my oldest, he sleeps with his arms flung all over the place. You never know how you're going to find him. And my little girl, I'll walk in, her name's Liberty, and she buries herself in stuffed animals. So you have to kind of peel them back just to look at her. But when I look at them, I'm filled with an overwhelming sense of responsibility. There's a truth that drives me as it should drive you. It was stated very well by Mr. Reagan when he said freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We don't pass it on to our children in the bloodstream. It must be fought for, protected, and handed on for them to do the same. Or one day we will spend our sunset years telling our children and our children's children what it was like in the United States when it was once free. That isn't to be our lot. Not if we stand. Not if we stand. There is hope. We must never lose sight of hope. But hope comes at a cost. The cost of time and effort. The cost of standing when you'd rather sit down. The cost of standing when you're fatigued by the battle. But we must stand. We must stand so our children will know the freedoms we've enjoyed. We must stand for the principles that made this a great nation. We must stand so that true liberty can be given a new burst of energy. We must stand up to the ideological oppression of a liberal elite who would rewrite history to suit their own ends. We must stand up for the right to life for those who cannot yet stand for themselves. We must stand for the basic building block of society called the family, rather than have it damaged by those who refuse contentment with God's beauty in the gift of marriage. We must stand for individual strength rather than collective weakness. We must stand. I paraphrase one of our brothers, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was killed for his beliefs. Not to speak speaks. Not to act is itself an action. And not to stand is to sit idly by while our freedoms perish. So let's stand up and see what we can do together. Because I believe that this state and this nation's worth it. We can stand so that government that's truly of, by, and for the people will not perish from the earth. I believe that future generations will judge how we stood for truth in our time. And my hope is that the ideas that you've heard today and tonight will fire you up to stand for something, to go back to your communities, to speak truth into the world around you, to speak it carefully but forcefully, and allow this state to have a revival. I believe that we are capable of changing this state and becoming a catalyst to change the entire country. But it will only happen if we stand together. I've been honored to serve you, and I pray that you would pray for me as I pray for you, and that you would pray for those who serve in the Wyoming legislature, and the governor's office, and in the judiciary of our state. So that the freedoms that we've inherited will continue on to our children. Thank you very much.